primarily been working with text in C# Windows Form projects using a text box or a list box or labels. And the disadvantage of those is there's some limitations, particularly in the area of formatting. We can't use different fonts or assign different fonts or different colors to specific words or phrases in a text box. But we're used to doing that in word processors, such as Microsoft Word or WordPerfect, Notepad, and so forth. Fortunately, C# has a control called a rich text box control. Now, you may not be familiar with rich text format, but if you were to look at Microsoft Word and go to save a file, there's an option there to save it as an RTF file. And a rich text format is common pretty much amongst all word processing software, so that's easy to share files and retain the formatting between different applications. The RTF format is somewhat similar to what you might think of in terms of HTML. There are tags that are embedded in the text that tells it what fonts to use, what sizes, what colors, what the margins are, and so forth. So in this example, I've created an application out of C#, and I have a rich text box control, which is here. And it looks just like a normal text box control, except I can select a word or drag through and select several words or a sentence or a phrase or a paragraph, and I can do things like change the fonts. So I've got a button down here that brings up the standard font dialog, and maybe I want to change that font to let's do something a little bit wild here. I'm going to choose elephant, and I can make italics bold or italic bold. Sometimes these are oblique, depends on the terminology used for that particular font. I can also change the size. Let's change this to 14. And I'm going to say OK. And now you see that that selected text has a changed font. I can also select text and change the color using the standard color dialog. And then I can save that file into an RTF format that retains those hidden tags that you don't see here that control that this is orange and that used elephant 14, and that everything else in here I think is Microsoft Sans Serif 11 point. So I'm going to click Save RTF. I get the standard file dialog, and in the folder where I have my application, I can save my file anywhere, but I'm going to save it into the folder where I have my application, and I'm just going to call this video test. And then I have some choices over here. I can open a file, and I can open a file just as text where I strip out all of that RTF coding. I can clear the text, and I can save the file just as a text file without the RTF coding. Let me open another file. It's going to be the same information but formatted a little bit differently. So again, a standard open file dialog. I'm going to open up my document.rtf. And you can see it loads in with the rich text formatting in place. I'm going to go back and open up that file we just modified earlier, which is our video test. And you can see how it saved that information and brought it back in. So let's take a look at the code for doing this. In Visual Studio, I created a C# project that I named RTF Editor. And the central piece of my form is a rich text box control found in the Common Controls area of our toolbox, just like a text box, but it does have an additional property called RTF that maintains the text with the RTF tags. It also has a text property that is just the text. So I named that RTF text box RTF Editor. I also have a very small little text box here on top of that that's going to be the visible property is set to false, so the user doesn't see it. And this is called TXT default font. I'm going to use the font of that hidden text box as my default font when I'm opening a file that I just want the text for with no formatting. And that'll make it easy then to set the font of our rich text box control to the font of our TXT default font text box. Then I have several buttons here. So we have a BTN set font, a BTN set color, BTN save file. We're going to save the file with the rich text formatting in place. We're going to be able to open an RTF file, open an RTF file as text and strip out all of that RTF formatting, clear whatever text is in the box here, and save the file as a text file rather than an RTF file, and again stripping out all that RTF code. And then I've also added a font dialog, a color dialog, a save file dialog, and an open file dialog. If we look at the save file dialog, I did set up some filters. And so those filters are rich text format with a star.rtf pair, a text file with a .txt as my second pair. So those are our two filters. I give a default file name of my document.rtf, and then for the open file dialog, use the same filters. All right, I'm going to dock my properties window. And let's take a look at the code for the set font button. So this is called BTN set font. One thing to note, I added a directive for using system.io. We're going to use some stream reader and stream writer objects in writing our file and reading our files. So here's our BTN set font. Click event being handled. I have the font dialog I'm going to show, and then whatever font is chosen, font dialog.font, is applied to the RTF editor rich text box control and the property of selection font. So whatever text is selected, it's going to have a selection font property for that selected text, and we're setting the font value of that text in the RTF editor. It is that simple to create rich text formatting in a rich text box control. Same thing for setting the color. So we have that BTN set color button. Calling the color dialog, setting the color of that color dialog to the selection color property in RTF editor. When we go to save our file as a rich text format file, I have a try-catch set up, and we're going to create a file name string variable. Then we're going to set up a stream writer object, and then I set some of the properties of a save file dialog, such as the default extension being RTF, using the filter index 1, and then the file name being my document RTF. You saw I set that in the properties as well, but I might change that when we go to save a file as a text file. And I'm going to show that dialog. Once the user provides a file name, and as long as that file name is not blank, we're going to set up our stream writer to create a text file using the file name that was selected. We're going to write the contents of that entire rich text box control named RTF editor to write, and what I'm writing is not the text, I'm writing the RTF property. That RTF property contains all the rich text formatting code that is hidden from our view of that control. And then I simply close the file. If something went wrong, then we have a message box coming up saying unable to save the file. Again, pretty straightforward and simple to save an RTF file. To open RTF text, kind of the same thing. We're going to create a stream reader this time. We're going to do our open file dialog, show the dialog, get the file, and if it's not blank, we're going to open a stream writer with open text in the name of our file, and then we're going to set the RTF property of that rich text box to the entire contents of that file. So reading to the end and closing the file, and again, if something went wrong, we're going to tell the user that we were unable to open the file. If we want to open a file just as text, pretty much the same thing. The difference here is we're going to set the text property rather than the RTF property of the RTF editor. And then I'm going to give it a default font, so I'm going to select everything, and I'm going to change the font to whatever the font is of that TXT default font. I think that's probably Microsoft Sans Serif 11. Then we're going to close. And again, if something went wrong, we'll say unable to open the file. If I want to clear the text of that text box, if we clear the RTF, that'll clear the text as well. And then our save as a text file, I didn't name that button, apparently it's just button 1. In the save file dialog, making a few changes here. I'm going to set the default extension to txt. Our filter index is 2, that's the text file. And here I'm changing the file name to mydocument.txt as the default, opening the file dialog. And as long as the file name is not empty, in other words, they didn't close the file dialog, the save file dialog without setting up a file, we're going to create the text. And here instead of writing the RTF property, we're writing the text property. And again, we're doing it all at one time using the write command rather than write line, and closing our file. And if something went wrong, we'll tell the user that. That is our code. So pretty straightforward, using a rich text box control and allowing the user to do some formatting. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the C# Xamarin Programming Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.